Good morning, church. Hey, if we have not had a chance to meet yet, my name is Doug. I am one of the pastors here. And if you've been with us for the past few weeks, you know that we've been in a series about a guy named David, a guy in the Bible named David, who started off as an insignificant shepherd boy and ended up becoming the king over all of ancient Israel. And this morning, we're going to talk about a time in David's life where he was so completely overwhelmed that he had no choice but to turn to God for strength. And if you're here this morning and you're facing any sort of difficult situation in your life, as we all are, or a challenging set of circumstances, something that's just on your mind that needs to be solved, needs to be figured out, something that you're walking through, or just feeling overwhelmed by life, my prayer is that just like David, you'll find strength in the Lord today. In fact, we're actually going to set aside a little time at the end of the service this morning for you to get prayed for. So towards the end of the service, we're just going to create some space, some worship time, and have some of our ministry team come forward and just be available for prayer, because there isn't a single one of us that's in the room that isn't either walking through something difficult or walking alongside someone else who is walking through something difficult. And so with that in mind, I want to ask you this question. Have you ever tried to lift something that's too heavy for you? Either at home or at work, right? Tried to lift something, tried to move something. Nope, not gonna be able to budge that. I thought I could, and I couldn't. So when I was in high school, I've never been a particularly big guy, right? I've always been surrounded by other guys that are bigger than me, even stronger than me. But in high school, I was probably about 100, 150, 155 pounds. I played water polo, and so I was around some guys that were quite a bit bigger than me. In fact, we had this one guy that I played water polo with. His name was Sam, and his nickname was Horse because he was just this big, strong guy. So one day, we're all in the weight room. We're working out before practice. We're in the weight room, and everyone's kind of lifting, and he's on the bench, and he's lifting more than all of us can bench, right? All of us are like, oh my gosh, like we want to be like Sam when we grow up, right? It's this big guy. He's got 2 plates on either side, and he's putting it up really kind of like it's no big deal. And in the back of my mind, I'm thinking to myself, I wonder if I can lift that much. Like I'm wondering if I'm like looking at it like, it doesn't look like, okay, pick up a 45-pound weight. Like, okay, that's not too bad. Like, I bet you I could do that. So anyway, long story short, the weight room clears out. Everyone's done. Everyone's finished. We're supposed to go into the locker room and get changed to head into the pool and get into practice. And there's still a couple of plates on either side. Now, you do the math on it, 45-pound bar, 45-pound, 45, 45, 45. So it's 225 pounds. I'm looking at it, and I'm just curious, but I'm too embarrassed to try it in front of people because if I fail, I don't want to look dumb. And so the weight room clears out, and I go sit down on the bench. Pinky's on the line. And I get it off the rack. And that's right. So it's up above me. I get it up off the rack. And I'm like, this is really heavy. And so I start to lower it down. And gravity takes over and just pulls that weight down to my chest. It is on my chest. And I can't move. Like it's not one of those like, and I can kind of move it a little bit. I can't move at all. I am completely stuck. It's on my chest. I'm feeling my rib cage just start to like implode, right? And I'm holding this thing. And it's now that I wish that there was somebody else in the weight room, right? Oh, this is why everyone uses a spotter. Oh, that makes a lot more sense now. So I am trapped under this bar. Now, thankfully, there were no locks on either side. So I'm laying there and I realize it's starting to lean one direction and the plates are starting to slide. And I think, oh, that might actually save my life. And so I just let it sort of lean. The plates slide off and fall off on this side, jumps on this side, those fall off, and I was free, and I stand before you now because of that. So my question again, have you ever tried to lift something that was just too heavy for you? Now, hopefully you've never almost killed yourself in a weight room like I nearly did, but all of us, every single one of us have faced things in life that have just been too hard, too much, too overwhelming, too heavy. And this morning, as we continue our study on the life of David, we get to a part of his story where he was so completely overwhelmed that he had no choice but to turn to God for strength. And so if you have a Bible with you this morning, I'm going to invite you to turn to 1 Samuel chapter 30. 1 Samuel chapter 30. If you don't have a Bible with you this morning, it's going to be on the screen behind me, so you'll be able to follow along. But we're going to go to 1 Samuel chapter 30. It's the 9th book of the Old Testament. We're almost at the end of 1 Samuel. And if you know, there's actually a second part of this story. There's 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. And so we'll be continuing over the next few weeks into 2 Samuel as we continue our study on the life of David. And as you turn there, we're gonna read a passage out of 1 Samuel 30 in just a moment. But as you turn there, let me remind you of what we've talked about so far in this series. I recognize that every week there's people who are joining us for the first time, and if we just sort of jump in, you might be a little bit lost. So let me bring you up to speed. So a few weeks ago, we kicked off this series by talking about Israel's very first king, a guy by the name of King Saul. And if you remember, King Saul blew it and repeatedly disobeyed God. And so God chose a new king, a young shepherd boy by the name of David. But David didn't become king right away. In fact, he continued to spend most of his time out in the fields tending his father's sheep until one day when his father sent him to the front lines of a battle between the Philistine army and the Israelite army to check in on his brothers. And it's there that we kind of get to the famous story of David and Goliath, where David fought and killed a huge Philistine warrior named Goliath with nothing but a few rocks and a slingshot. Side note, anybody remember, a little Bible trivia for you, anybody remember what town Goliath was from? Gath. The town of Gath. Now, the reason I ask that is it's going to come into play in a moment in our story. So in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 4, in the famous story of David and Goliath, we find out that Goliath is from a Philistine town called Gath. Hold on to that little bit of information, put it in your pocket. We're going to need that in a few minutes. So after David killed Goliath, a few important things happened. Number one, David became best friends with King Saul's son, Jonathan. And number two, King Saul became so insanely jealous, you'll remember this if you've been with us, so insanely jealous of David's growing popularity that he tried to kill him repeatedly. He actually forced David to leave his house and his family and flee into the desert. And even though David had two perfect, handed to him on a platter opportunities to get back at Saul, one in chapter 24 and one in chapter 26, David showed incredible restraint, and 2 times he spared Saul's life. And if you were here last week, you may remember that right in between those two situations, those two events in chapter 24 and chapter 26, David had an encounter with an ill-mannered landowner named Nabal and his intelligent and beautiful wife named, anybody remember her name? Abigail, right. And even though the story did not end very well for Nabal, it did end up well for David because he ended up marrying Abigail after her husband Nabal unexpectedly died. And it's here in the story that David's life takes another unexpected turn. And let me kind of bring you up to speed here so that as we get ready to read, we'll have the backstory in mind. See, at this point, or up to this point, David and his men had been living out in the desert. Remember, David was on the run from King Saul for several years. He'd begin to gather some guys around him who were in debt or sort of had some legal issues, and they began to kind of gather around David. And so they're living out in the desert. And they'd been constantly on the move from one place to another because they had to try to stay one step ahead of King Saul. And so by the time we get to chapter 27, David and his men are exhausted. I mean, they're tired of running. They're tired of hiding. They're tired of constantly looking over their shoulder, right? Wondering if Saul and his army are right around the corner. And so they decide to hide somewhere that Saul will never find them. They decide to hide smack dab in the middle of the Philistine territory. And just in case you don't know much about the Philistines, not only were they the most hated arch enemies of the Israelites at the time, but don't forget that the legendary event that put David on the map was the day that he defeated the Philistines by killing their champion Goliath, right? So the Philistines were not big fans of David at this point. None of the Philistines were wearing like David's starter jerseys. None of them had "We Love David" pennants or banners, right? They did not like David. And if living in the Philistine territory wasn't dangerous enough for David, 1 Samuel chapter 27, verse 3 tells us that the Philistine town that David and his men and their families ended up settling in was a town called Gath. Okay, remember, pull that information out of your pocket. Who was from Gath? Goliath, right? Goliath was, as far as we can tell, born and raised in Goliath, the same Goliath that David had killed back in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Talk about entering into the belly of the beast, right? So now David and his men are literally living in the exact same town where Goliath's mom and dad and brothers and sisters and his whole high school basketball team lived, right? I mean, it's like right smack dab in the middle of where Goliath was from. This is crazy. And as crazy as David's escape plan sounds, it actually worked. It actually worked because 1 Samuel 27:4 tells us that when Saul learned that David had fled to Gath, it says he no longer searched for him. Saul called off the search. Oh, he's in Philistine territory? Okay, we're not going in there. Called off the search, which meant that finally, after years of running and hiding from King Saul, David was finally safe, at least for the moment. Because even though he may have been safe from Saul and Saul's army, living in Goliath's hometown was probably not the safest place for David and his men either. So in 1 Samuel chapter 27, verse 5, David asked the Philistine ruler, a guy by the name of Achish, for permission to live somewhere else in the Philistine territory. So Achish agreed and gave David a place called Ziklag to live. So David and his men and their wives and children and all their families relocated and settled in this town called Ziklag. And it's here in Ziklag that David's story takes a devastating turn. And we're just about to read the passage. Because while David and his men were getting ready to fight alongside Achish and the Philistine army in chapter 29, a group of local terrorists and slave traders known as the Amalekites attacked Ziklag. So David and his men are gone. They're getting ready to fight alongside the Philistines. They'd kind of been conscripted in to fight alongside the Philistines, leaving the wives and children just alone in Ziklag. This group of terrorists and slave traders known as the Amalekites come in and they attack Ziklag and kidnap the women and the children who were living there. And that's where we pick up the story here in chapter 30. So let's read verses 1 through 6 and find out what happens. It says this: David and his men reached Ziklag on the third day of their journey. Now the Amalekites had raided the Negev and Ziklag. They had attacked Ziklag and burned it, and had taken captive the women and everyone else in it, both young and old. They killed none of them, but they carried them off as they went on their way. That phrase, carried them off, is like a cattle herding term. It's like they herded them. They drove them. So again, the Amalekites are going to use these women and children as slaves. That's their goal. We pick it up in verse 3. When David and his men reached Ziklag, they found it destroyed by fire, and their wives and their sons and their daughters taken captive. And so David and his men did what you and I would do. They wept. They wept aloud until they had no strength left to weep. David's two wives had been captured, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal of Carmel. David was greatly distressed because the men were talking of stoning him. Each of them were bitter in their spirit because of their sons and daughters. But David found strength in the Lord his God. Stop there. On December 5th, 2017, the day after the Thomas fire swept through our city and burned hundreds of homes, I remember walking with my son up Colina Vista Road, just about a mile away from here, up in the foothills. This is the day after the fire had swept through. We're walking up through the neighborhood to go and see if his girlfriend's family's house was still standing. They had no way of knowing whether it was standing. They'd been evacuated. They weren't allowed to get in. We were able to sort of sneak in. And so we were going up and checking on different people's homes. People were texting us and calling us, can you check? Can you check? So we were on our way up Colina Vista, up to the top, to check on his girlfriend's family's house. And I'll never forget that walk because we're walking through the neighborhood and it just felt like the aftermath of a zombie apocalypse. It was just bizarre to see. Some of you know, some of you firsthand experienced that. House after house as we walked up were burned to the ground. Smoke was still coming up from the ashes. There were still spot fires burning. There were still frames of homes still burning to the ground. And we kept running into people who lived up there who had just found out, who had just walked up to see that their family home or their grandparents' home or the home that they grew up in or the home that had everything that they owned in it had been burned to the ground. They just found out that they had lost everything. So we just kept running into people who were just dazed, shocked, overwhelmed, processing this news. And I imagine that that's what it must have been like for David and his men. As they saw the smoke in the distance, they'd been traveling. They were here with the Philistine army. They'd been sent back, so they're going back home. On the third day, they crest the hill and they see smoke coming up. And it's a lot more smoke than a campfire. It's a lot more smoke than the women and children are barbecuing in preparation for the men coming home. It's a lot of billowing black smoke. And they crest the hill and their hearts begin to sink as they see in the valley their entire city burned to the ground. But not only for these men and David, not only were their homes destroyed and all of their earthly possessions gone, but their families had been carried off too. Carried off by a ruthless band of slave traders. And verse 4 tells us that David and his men wept aloud until they had no more strength left to weep. They wept aloud until they had no more strength to weep. You ever been there? You ever felt like that? You ever felt so utterly overwhelmed by grief or worry or fear or anxiety or pain or loss that just like David, you felt like you just had no more strength left to weep? I know I have. And I know that many of us in this room know exactly how that feels. We've been there. Or we've sat with people who have been there. But not only was David dealing with his own personal loss, his wives had been taken, his home had been burned. This guy's been on the run for years, had to leave his previous house, been chased out into the desert, had been on the lam for years. Finally has a place to sort of call his own. It's not a cave. Burned to the ground. But not only was David feeling his own personal loss, which we can identify with, but he was also feeling a sense of responsibility. He was their leader, right? He was responsible for protecting his men. He was responsible for protecting their families, and he had failed to do so. Ultimately, the responsibility lied on him. And in fact, the passage even tells us that David's men are so overwhelmed with grief that they did what we all do when tragedy strikes, right? They looked for someone to blame. We all need to, when something tragic strikes, something terrible happens, we just naturally do that. It was the doctor, it was the first nurse, it was the ambulance driver, it was that financial advisor, it was that family member, it was that situation. We find someone to blame and hold accountable for the devastating thing that we're experiencing. That's exactly what they did. And since David was their leader and the closest target, they blamed him. In fact, verse 6 tells us that David was greatly distressed Because why? His men were talking about stoning him. Their pain was so overwhelming, it had to be directed at someone, and David was the most likely target. And so they're actually talking about killing their leader. Each of them were bitter in spirit because of their sons and their daughters. No wonder David was greatly distressed. He was dealing with his own loss, but on top of his own loss, he was feeling a sense of responsibility for the loss of the people around him. Now, spoiler alert, later in the chapter, David and his men actually catch up to the Amalekites. They defeat them in battle, and they take back their families. But at this point in the story here in verses 1 through 6, David and his men have no idea if they're ever going to see their families again. And so they are completely overwhelmed by sorrow and grief and loss and pain. And friends, that's what makes verse 6 so powerful. Because in verse 6 we read, "But David found strength in the Lord his God." But David found strength in the Lord his God. He has no idea in this moment what's going to happen. He has no idea where his family is. He has no idea where his men's families are. He has no idea how this situation is going to resolve. He has no idea. This is not some moment when David knew and he took strength. No, David had no idea in this moment how this situation was going to resolve. And yet, the scripture says in the middle of that circumstance, in the middle of that situation, in the middle of that pain, in the middle of the anxiety, in the middle of the pressure and the doubt, but David found strength in the Lord his God. And as I read this passage this week, and I read it over and over, this section, over and over and over again this week, and as I read it this week, I couldn't help but think about the people I know here in Ventura Missionary Church. Us, who are facing really overwhelming circumstances. Health issues. I mean, who of us either isn't personally experiencing health issues or have people that we love and care about that we're watching struggle? Family issues. Which of us in a family hasn't or isn't walking alongside someone else who is dealing with some challenges and issues in their families? Marriage issues. I've got several friends right now that are walking through really, really difficult marriage issues. Issues with kids or grandkids or other family members. Aging parents or grandparents. The recent loss of loved ones that still, when the right song plays or the right smell comes up or the right picture pops up on our history, doesn't send us right back to that moment when we first found out. Financial issues. I don't know what we're going to do. I don't know how we're going to solve this. I don't know how we're going to get out of this. I don't know how I got myself into this. Issues at work. Issues at school. And the list goes on and on. And we all do the same thing because we come to church on Sunday morning and we shake hands and we give hugs and we smile and we greet one another and we ask how the other person is doing, and the other person says, "I'm good, how are you?" And we say, "I'm good too. All right, God bless you, I'll see you in there." And we all go in and we take our spots and we sing our songs and we sit and we listen to the sermon and we sing another song, and then we go out and we get into our car and we're overwhelmed. So this morning as your pastor, I want us to do something a little bit different as we finish out our time together this morning. I want to just set aside these last few minutes of our service and just create some space for us to worship, to give praise to God, but also to pray and to receive prayer. So our worship team is going to come back onto the stage, and I'm going to invite our ministry team to come forward. So some of our prayer team and pastors and elders are just going to stand and come forward, and they're going to kind of line up here on the sides a little bit and just be available. And church family, this is what I'm going to invite you to do. If you're physically able, would you just go ahead and stand to your feet? And as you stand here, here's my invitation. Here's my invitation. every single one of us in the room is going through something difficult. Maybe it's not utterly overwhelming. Maybe you're not on the ground in tears, but it's just hard stuff. Every single one of us in the room has people in our lives, family member, friends, people that we work with, that are just going through hard stuff. And so this is what we're gonna do this morning. Josh and the team are gonna lead us in worship, and we're gonna worship and sing. And I'm gonna pray, and after I pray, I'm just gonna invite you to come forward and receive prayer. There's gonna be some of you like, I don't wanna do that. Everyone's watching and I don't feel comfortable doing it. I'll just pray on my own. That's fine. Nobody's gonna like make you. But why would you not come forward and agree with somebody in your church family that can just put their hands on your shoulders and say, let me pray with you. Let me pray for you. Because my desire for you, my heart for you this morning is that you, like David, would find strength in the Lord your God. And so if there's anything that's going on in your life or a family member's life or a friend's life, and you need strength or they need strength and they just need to know that you're praying for them for strength, then in a moment I'm going to invite you to come forward, find one of these people and just say, hey, can you pray for me? And they'd love to pray for you, that we would walk out of here feeling strengthened in the Lord. And this goes for you in the balcony as well. I know it's a long walk. You'll be fine. Let me pray. Lord God, we love you, we glorify you, we honor you, and I pray right now that in this moment that you would begin to infuse us with your strength. Even as we take a step of faith and come forward and receive prayer, God, would you meet us in this place, and would you begin to strengthen us and encourage us and build us up, that just like David in the middle of what he was facing, Lord, that we would find strength in the Lord our God. I pray that you would meet us here in this place. I pray this now in Jesus' name.